This is question 17 from part 1 of the 2016 TSA paper. In this question we're asked, which option, if true, most weakens the argument? So let's look at what the argument says. So the first few sentences are just setting up this issue. They say, some say religion is crucial for providing us with a moral framework, giving clear moral guidance. Without religion, people might lose their sense of morality altogether. But those who argue this ought to consider the ancient Greeks. So this is setting up the position the writer is arguing against. They're arguing against the idea that religion is necessary for morality. They say the Greeks thought about what makes for a good life and how to live well, and the word ethics comes from them. So this is saying Greeks thought about ethics just as a factual statement about history. Then they say, although the Greeks had gods, they weren't role models, and they give the example of Zeus being an adulterer. So that's again a historical fact. Next they say there was nothing by way of an agreed religious text of moral rules. That's another historical fact. And then similarly there was an atheist movement in ancient Greece. That's also a historical fact. And then finally they say the Greeks alone are proof that if we are to lose our faith in God, this does not mean we must also lose our faith in morality. So they're saying we can have morality without faith in God. This being a particular instance of religion, which is what the writers argue against. They argue against the idea of religion is necessary for morals. So this is a particular instance of religion which they're saying isn't necessary for morals. Okay, so let's look at the argument structure and the options and see which option most undermines the conclusion. Okay, so first, under reasons, I've written down all these historical facts the writer's relying on about the ancient Greeks. And we're trying to look for the main conclusion in their argument. But what they're mostly doing is arguing against the position which is that religion is necessary for morality. And if you're trying to find a counterexample to that, which is what they're saying the Greeks are, then you need to show that the Greeks did have morality without it coming from religion. So there's basically a couple of intermediate conclusions that the reader's making. From the fact the Greeks thought about ethics, that they're using that to show that the Greeks still had a moral framework. And then from these other facts about the Greek gods and Greek religion, they're saying that the Greek morals didn't come from their religion. And that's what makes them a counterexample, and then that gives us the main conclusion: we can have morality without, in this case, the writer's arguing for without faith in God, but in general without religion. Okay, so this is the main conclusion, and we're looking for something that undermines this as directly as possible. Let's look at our options. So these are our 5 options. We'll mark each of them as strengthening, weakening, or being neutral towards some part of the argument. So let's take these options one by one and see which parts of the argument they're relevant to. So firstly, some Greek gods were heroic. So this is relevant to this reason, that, for the writer's conclusion, that Greek gods weren't moral role models. And it does weaken that reason to an extent, because if gods were heroic, then maybe they were moral role models by being heroic, although there is a distinction between being a hero and actually being a moral person. So in any case, this undermines one reason for this intermediate conclusion and for this conclusion. But let's look for something that undermines the main conclusion more directly if possible. B says the Greeks took their moral guidance as much from poetry and drama as from religion. So that's not directly addressing any of these reasons, but it is relevant to this intermediate conclusion. It's actually strengthening that position. So it's strengthening the intermediate conclusion that Greek morals didn't come from religion, because it's saying they came from poetry and drama instead. So let's look at C. C says many Greeks question the value of morality. So it looks like that's weakening this intermediate conclusion that the Greeks were still moral. It's only weakening it, it's not completely contradicting it, but it is still weakening this intermediate conclusion. And then let's look at these other two. Faith in God is increasing in many parts of the world. Well, that's not relevant to the Greeks, and it's not relevant to the link between morality and faith in God. So that's just neutral to the argument. And likewise, E, believers often disagree over religious texts. Well, it might be relevant to think about religion in general, but it's not relevant to this argument, in particular to the argument from the status of the ancient Greeks. So this is also just neutral. And that means we're looking at these two options, which both weaken part of the argument. But option A only weakens one reason for this intermediate conclusion. There are still more reasons. Whereas option C directly weakens an important part of the counterexample. In order to show you can have morality without faith in God, you need an example where you're sure the people you're talking about were still moral, and this is weakening that part of your argument. So that means C is what most weakens the argument, so our answer is C.